legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffitt. To start today, I'd just like to thank those of you who've become Legalize Freedom subscribers since I introduced the subscribers section a few months ago. Subscribers get access to the second half of each news show for as little as 77 pence per week. If you'd like to get that, just go to legalizefreedom.com, scroll down to the bottom half of the homepage, and you'll see the membership options laid out there. My guest today is Jasun Horsley, who joins me to ponder the question, what if some people out there in the world are not like us? Some people go through life not quite feeling fully part of the human race, surrounded by untold millions who seem to want from life only that which they are told they should want. Those who refuse a simple life of comfort and consumption are often made to feel like misfits and failures by the corporate machines and media matrix which promote and profit from mass conformity. But what if there are more bodies than souls on earth, and despite what we are told, all people are not in fact created equal? Do all humans really have the same potential? Are all the people in the world fully human, or merely existing rather than living, even human at all? A Tulpa is a paranormal being created through spiritual or mental powers, either through a deliberate act of individual will or unintentionally from the thoughts of numerous people. Could this concept account for the strange, uncanny sense some people have about many of the humanoid beings they live among, and about a consensus reality splintering more and more with each passing day? Hi Jason, thanks so much for joining us again today on legalizefreedom.com.
Hello Greg.
Jason, just in case there's some people listening to this who don't know, just let people know who you are and what you do.
I don't know. That question, well, it changes every time I get asked it, and currently I'm practicing what I preach and putting my money where my mouth is in terms of being a liminalist, which is the name of the podcast that I'm winding up currently. The liminal means the space between. It also means non-structure or anti-structure. And it's where all the good stuff happens, is in the liminal space, I would say. And so, airports, they're liminal places, hotels, where you're you're away from one state to another state. And which we always are, really. We're always in motion. But it's particularly so now. So I was a writer, but I just wrote possibly my last book, 16 Matters of Hell, which I think we were maybe going to talk about, but then we came up with something else to talk about. And as I said, I'm winding up my podcast, so I'm not really a podcaster anymore. But I would say that I'm an adventurer and a spiritual explorer, which is a bit different from a spiritual seeker. In that, spiritual seekers is kind of a cliche, whereas I like the term explorer. I just invented it there, spiritual explorer. And I've been engaged for 54 years. That's how old I am, and it did start in childhood, in trying to understand what it means to be human, and where we are, where I am, how I got here, and where I'm going, and why I'm here, and when will I arrive. The big questions, they've always been on my mind. And so I dedicated a large chunk of my life to writing books and essays and making films and sort of multimedia creativity, but particularly emphasis on writing, and a particular emphasis on the dark side of the human experience, because I would say that the reason we don't know the answers to those questions, because all the other creatures on the earth do, is because we've been severely traumatized by a malevolent social system. And well, yeah, so I wanted to get to the bottom of that, like how did the world end up the way it is? This torture chamber of a prison camp world that society is, not the earth, not the planet. Anyway, so I'm in this transition between culture and nature, trying to make the steps back to nature, and I see it as a logical, necessary endpoint to my decades of creativity and writing. Not that I'm saying it would completely end, but it had to have some sort of trajectory towards wholeness, wholesomeness, healthy living, happiness. Because you can't investigate, you can't map hell, as I put it, indefinitely. You'll never leave then. There has to be a point to mapping hell, and the only point to mapping hell is to find the exit. So I'm currently, that's the stage I'm at now. I've mapped the exit, and now I'm seeing if I can go through it, which would be the final proof to others, but to myself, that I did actually find it. Whether you'll hear anything from me on the other side remains to be seen.
Well, as different as we appear to be, I think I've been on the same basic journey. To be quite honest, if life has taught me anything, it's that the idea of arriving somewhere is kind of always upended, always thwarted. You know, I've learnt this to my cost recently. You know, I'm here, and then it's like, well, no, you're still moving. You know, so I think that's an ongoing process. I don't think we ever really arrive. I don't know what death looks like, or if there's anything on the other side. I'll find out soon enough, no doubt. But in where we find ourselves now, there isn't really any arrival. And I think that's what frustrates a lot of people, because that's what they just want things to be settled, but they never are. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I feel. It's kind of just get over this idea that you're going to arrive anywhere.
Yeah, well, I think there is a settling that can happen, but that would be an inner. So if our nervous systems get settled, then we don't need any kind of external security or stability, because, as you say, there's no such thing. Everything is constantly dying and regenerating down to our cells in our body, but there is an inner peace that doesn't have to be some sort of mystical pot of gold at the end of an imaginary rainbow. It's very simple. The nervous system is relaxed and calm, in harmony with itself and with its environment. Which is that's liminalism again, being at ease with constant change and constant instability. That's the stability paradox. That's where we find the stability.
Yes, oh, absolutely. Yeah, you can have that inner core that's at rest, as it were. All around it is in motion.
Yeah, the eye of the hurricane.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned your latest book, 16 Maps of Hell, and the original idea was that we'd have a talk about that, but we couldn't really settle on anything, and to be honest, I still haven't finished reading it. It's a rather large book.
Yeah.
But I found during this so-called lockdown, sort of the last almost year and a half of the pandemic, like a lot of people who had their daily routines disrupted, I found that my sleep pattern was very disrupted. And I was tending towards staying up late and getting up relatively late. And it's something that I really didn't like. It wasn't agreeing with me, and it's something I've been trying to address recently. With success, actually. I'm getting there. I want to sleep longer, and I want to sleep better. It's very, very important, I think, for our health. In any event, one thing I've taken to doing was, rather than ending the evening with artificial light and electronic stimulation, that I would go to bed before I was ready to go to bed and rest just in darkness, even if I couldn't sleep, and try and feed my mind with something beneficial. So I've been listening to podcasts. Quite a lot of people do this, actually. They listen to some sort of media, when they're falling asleep.
And I gave this a go. I'd never done this before, but I gave it a go. So I was listening to one of yours. It was something fairly recently you posted, but it was from your archive from quite a long time ago. Mm. And as I was drifting off to sleep, you were speaking, and the phrase came out, what if some people out there in the world are not like us? And the whole thing that you spoke about, you and your guest, really, really captured my imagination, because it was something that is a question that I had asked in various forms throughout my life. So, and that really got me to thinking. And then I messaged you about it, and my feelings about it. Well, that was from an earlier incarnation of your podcast, I understand.
That was the last episode of Stormy Weather, the closing time, the Sorcerer's Revelation, which I felt spontaneously, through a couple of nudges, compelled to revisit. And one of the nudges was that line that Dave O'Shana, who's a spiritual coach guy from East End and living in Finland, who I've been working with and playing with, not in a band, but in some kind of strange experimental human project, for over a decade now. Anyway, on a recent event that he hosted, he said those words, what if it was starting to occur to him that maybe, what if some people out there weren't like us? So that was one of the nudges, but there'd been a couple others. Somebody in that same group or that field uses the term straw dogs. She was saying that a lot of people out there were straw dogs, which is from this Chinese, it's mentioned in the Tao Te Ching, but it refers to a tradition of creating straw dogs for ceremonies, and then they get thrown out, and it's comparing nature itself, that nature creates these forms and then discards them, but it doesn't worship them just because they're alive, and it's not disparaging them just because they're dead. It's just the nature of things, that things are created, forms are created, and then they're cast off. But anyway, this person was using the term straw dogs, I thought, in this specific sense, a sort of Truman Show kind of sense, that some people out there aren't like us, that they're more like temporary stand-ins or extras or actors pretending to be something they're not. They didn't elaborate, but the way that they were expressing it really reminded me of my insights during the time that I did the Sorcerer's Revelation. I presented it, and so I thought, I'll revisit it and just see if it's. I think with this last year, and this is also somewhat the context that David Shana was mentioning it, that he was becoming more and more sadly convinced that most people out there were, in his words, brain dead, that there wasn't really anybody home, based on the behaviors and the compliance and the lack of questioning and the social momentum, really, the crowd, the way that the crowd is moving. The mass of humanity seems to be moving in a way that lemmings never did. That's a false rumor or a misinformation campaign about lemmings, because apparently they never did herd themselves off mountains, but it was effective, if so, because human beings are imitating this fictional version of the lemming now. And so that did seem to be a new context, not really that new, but it's just become much more palpable, I would say, that the difference between myself and the mass of humanity, and I would say the need to recognize it and acknowledge it and talk about it in new ways, because we know about the old ways that they didn't work out very well, that elitism and scapegoating and persecution drives and hierarchies, these things don't work very well. So, but neither does pretending that all men and women are created equal, and that's supposed to be the antidote or the positive ideology. But those who created that ideology didn't practice it either, or at the very least it certainly hasn't led to a true democracy. So there's a clue in that. Either they were hypocrites lying, or they just got it wrong and idealists, and it was impossible to practice it. But there's really no evidence in nature that beings are created equal in a functional sense. We can say at a deep metaphysical level, we're all temporal, and so we're all going to be, no matter how large a number is, if you divide it by infinity, you still come up with zero. So in that context of death and eternity, there's no hierarchical difference between you or I and a beetle or a blade of grass. We're all temporal. We're all going to disappear completely and leave no traces. But that's a very deep, high, philosophical, metaphysical, and very abstract. So functionally, and certainly socially, there's no evidence for, and there seems to be no good reason for pretending that we're all equal. So then, I just wanted to reopen that area for discussion, because it wasn't really discussed. I mean, you mentioned me and another guest, but there wasn't another guest then or in the recent version. Neil Kramer was on there, but only because it was the last Stormy Weathers, and so I asked him just to...
That was Neil Kramer?
Yeah, that was Neil Kramer.
Oh my God, I didn't realise that. I thought, oh my God, this guy sounds like Neil Kramer, because in all honesty, when I listened to that, it reminded me of my one and only interview with Neil Kramer many years ago, and I mentioned that to you when I sent you a message. I said it reminds me of an interview with Neil Kramer. I don't know how I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, well, I assume that's why you said it, and I wondered, because Neil, who I'm not in touch with now, although I did tell him about this recent revisiting, as far as I know, he never talked, well, maybe he did with you, but he never talked about that interpretation of reality. I know that he was aware of it because I included him on that last podcast, and I remember afterwards he said something like, my God, people out there are actually going to be hearing this. So I know that he was struck at the time by how potentially controversial what I was saying was, and how dangerous I would say, or ballsy at least. But as far as I know, Neil and no one else has ever picked it up. I mean, maybe Neil did with you, I don't know. But hopefully he cited me. But it's not, anyway, my point was, it isn't something that I've talked about with anyone, I don't think. And I think there's a reason for that. I think it's a very difficult model to get our head around. It just feels like you just can't think that way. But I think we need to start thinking in ways that we think that we can't think very much.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come on to the question of equality in due course. That's a big part of this. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult insight to sort of to deal with. But I mean, I've felt that all my life as well. I've got a vivid memory of, it was in a seaside village that we lived in when my mum and dad split up. We went to stay with my grandparents temporarily, and I can see myself now standing in the driveway of the house, and a group of adults, some people had come to visit, and all the adults were standing in the driveway just before they went to the house, and they were talking, and I remember just stood there looking at them and just thinking, what? I didn't think in terms of swear words because I didn't have those to hand at the time, but now I would characterize it as like, what the fuck is the matter with these people? Just the drivel that I couldn't identify with them. I said, am I supposed to turn into one of these people? Is this what the future is? Is this what we should do? So I've had that question at the back of my mind all my life. And when I think it was through Neil actually that I first came upon the concept of the Tulpa, or the thought form. I'll say a bit about that in my recorded introduction, so by the time people get to this part of our talk, they'll already know, if they don't already, what Tulpa is. And yeah, I felt like I was in some kind of, it was looking around, saying, okay, where's the hidden camera in all of this? What sort of joke, TV show am I on here? When is a guy with a cheesy grin and a microphone going to pop out from behind the scenery and say, we almost had you there.
The candid camera reference
Yeah.
may not cross the Atlantic, I don't know, but certainly I grew up with that, with that model.
But if this basic idea that of most of the entities out there being, well, to use Dave's word, brain dead, it resonates very strongly with me, and it explains a lot of things. But as I just mentioned, it's deeply, deeply uncomfortable because, as I said to you prior to our talk, I always thought to myself, oh, who am I to think that somehow I'm not part of this mass of humanity, that in some way that I'm different. It's a really, really awkward thing. Some people are very comfortable with it, but not many, I suspect.
Well, I think it's hard to separate from misanthropy, and I was a misanthropist in my youth, even very young. I had a viewpoint that only stupid people were happy, and there were various different components to it, but essentially I was a misanthropist and an elitist. And I would say I was kind of bred that way by my Fabian, ancestors. But I'm not now. I don't consider myself to be now. And I do think this is radically different from simply the viewpoint that there's two kinds of people in the world, and some of us are spiritually in soul and capable of autonomy and more evolved, and the rest are just this kind of dross mass of humanity that are just to be herded and exploited, because that's clearly the viewpoint of the elite, and from the dark elite that people talk about a lot, and from their point of view, or from that point of view, you or I are part of the mass, the dross that's to be exploited. So clearly it's not compatible with that viewpoint, much less equivalent to it. It's something much more mysterious and more subtle, I would say, but I'm not quite sure I can say what it is yet, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, part of the reason why the general apprehension of the world is uncomfortable in the way that I mentioned is because it does tie in with what you just described as the dark elite. And I've often wondered if I was to meet any of these people, if I would end up identifying with them on some level, as as appalling as that sounds. One thing that I always felt was, or kind of observed to be happening and kind of resented, was that the fat controllers kind of doing everything they could or everything they can to dumb the mass of humanity down and then criticize them for it. By saying, look at you, look at you useless eaters, you idiots. But but inculcating that in them. And then the idea that I had, a bit like the guy at the end of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, who's running into the highway, screaming his head off, just going, wake up, they're here, look around, this idea of trying to save people. And I was disabused of that notion quite early on, like, don't try and, like, this idea of waking people up, the sort of thing that David Icke seems to be engaged in, which is probably where all his frustration stems from. You can't do that and you shouldn't do that.
Well, I think you can rope people into your own cult. That clearly is an effective means of social control, and it's a way to elevate oneself to a position of power, and it's also a way to give people meaning and make them feel like they're waking up, and you yourself as the cult leader might feel that you're being effective because you're getting them to agree with you. But I would say that second matrix stuff, as I've coined the term, it's an illusory awakening. We've got woke culture now as a written large, I don't know about history, but written on the on the cultural landscape. It's very obvious now. There's this whole movement called woke, which is to many of us the opposite of an awakening. I'm agreeing with you, but I was adding some sort of nuance there. I guess bring it to the personal about waking people up. That I think that, and part of the reason it's it's a bad idea, is that, yeah, you can turn people into yourself, or try to, or you can get them to see things that you've seen and think the way that you think, and they might think that they've woken up, and it might be useful to a point, but they're not really discovering their own potential that way. They're just finding a new hairstyle and a new outfit to wear where they feel more empowered, let's say. And I mean, I'm going to be all over the map here, but this is something that I've written about a number of times. One was when I was criticizing Jordan Peterson, that if you try and reach a lot of people, you're going to have to generalize your message. You can't customize it. And so the nature of trying to wake a lot of people up or alert a lot of people to certain truths is you have to dumb it down, and you have to essentially you're imposing a different level of conformity. You're getting people to conform to your truth rather than to the truth that they've been socially conditioned with. And yeah, it might be an antidote up to a point, but I would say that and this might contradict other things I'm going to say later, but that each of us is individual. I mean, even, it's the cliche of the snowflake, and that's all identity politics, potentially, that we're all unique snowflakes. That can be very narcissistic. But I think there is a geometrical or just a natural truth in that every blade of grass is subtly different from every other. And this would also be a way in which we're all equal. We're all potentially unique. So then it's more about recognizing the uniqueness in each individual or each creature on the planet, and well, just seeing it, really. But in the case of human beings, drawing that out. And so if we try and impose one size fits all, even if it's a big size that we think is enlightenment, say, or ultimate truth, if we try and impose that on a mass, where we're going to be doing a disservice, and I would say this relates to the lack of equality. Yeah, we're all equally unique, but part of the uniqueness is, or another aspect of it in a more general way, that we all have different levels of potential. Not everyone has equal potential, and it's extreme. It's an extreme perspective. Having worked in the thrift store, on the one hand, I got to largely undo my ancestral program of elitism, that the poor were just beneath me, and I didn't have to waste time with them. They were my bread and potatoes, whatever the expression is. That was how I was earning my living, and I was dealing with people one by one as individuals, and it wasn't just that they were poor. They were also extremely damaged people, but anyway, part of it is the poverty. And so I really got to see how wide a spectrum it is, how some people really can barely even function beyond just getting food or drugs for themselves, or both. And so there's absolutely no point in trying to awaken those people in the sense that we're talking about, or David Icke is talking about. But that doesn't mean that there's no point in trying to help them, or even, I think that's a slippery slope. But in finding what is within them that is of some value, finding a way to enjoy and appreciate the experience of encountering those people or those whatevers. And here I'd say is where it's the opposite of the persecution drive, is that whatever other people are, they're phenomena in our field of experience, and so there's something we can gain by interacting with them. But if we're really sensitive and we're really tuning into what others are, that as we're interacting with them, I think we might start to really be amazed and astonished. There really may be demons out there that take human form. There may be animals that can take human form. There may be holograms. Who knows? Like we could jump sharks very quickly if we start speculating and using actual examples. But on the other hand, it can be a bit vague and abstract if we don't the basic point is, just because people look like people, to assume that they're all exactly the same genetically, psychologically, emotionally, in terms of awareness, in terms of development, it's clearly absurd. It's just a question of how far we're willing to take the question that some people are not like other people, right? How big a spectrum might there be in our field of experience in terms of what we experience as people? And is there an answer to this question to why the world is the way it is? Because, if I look at pictures of people who shop at Walmart, there's an infamous website there, Walmart People, it's kind of, it's sort of dehumanizing people, but it's also showing how people dehumanize themselves by just presenting pictures of Walmart shoppers in the US. I forgot where I was going with that. Oh yeah, if I look at, God forbid, certain TV shows, and I realize that these are popular shows that apparently millions of people watch, and any other number of examples, if I look at the way that the world's going, there must be some sort of momentum behind that. And then I also hear that there's, I don't know if you know the number yet, but not yet, but still, if you've kept track of the supposed population figures, but 8 billion people or something, supposedly those 8 billion people exist. And so I deduce that's where a large part of the mass momentum comes, the energy, the fuel for the world that we see, right? So then, but I know that if the world only consisted of people like you or I can deduce logically, and I'm grouping you and I together, I mean, we're quite different, but still enough similarities that I feel I can do that, then the world wouldn't be the way it is. So I think there's a missing piece there. People say, well, it's just dark elite, they're manipulating the billions of people to make them into, right? Okay, yeah, but if they've been effective, they've turned people into zombies. And what is that? Like, what is a person who's been turned into a zombie? Right? We don't know, because it might be generational. It might have to do with the breeding practices have been so debased, sexual interaction, sexual consummation, procreation has been so debased that bodies are being born that are these empty vessels that can be, etc. I mean, I can keep going, but I'll be getting into metaphysics, but hopefully you get my point, that if people have been turned into something almost subhuman over the generations, well, how complex and how deep does that go?
Well, we know, we can observe, and we're told as well, I mean, at the most basic level, that I don't know how this varies across nations or other sort of demographics, but that there's a certain type of human being that's more likely to breed than others, and that people who think about the implications of it are less likely to do it. So you do get a lot of, to use the elite term, useless eaters, or you do get a lot of mindless shoppers turned out by people, that following a pattern, as it were. Mm-hmm. And that has, even in my lifetime, I think that's changed the dynamic in terms of the population of humans, or apparently those that appear to be human, and that's in a relatively short space of time. I mean, I think about the people in my life, friends, family, associates, colleagues, people that I've worked with and come to know, a lot of good people, because I don't have any enemies. I don't consider I've got any enemies, because there's a certain type of interaction I would have with someone, and I just don't involve them any further in my life. That's the end of the matter. So maybe that in the past has kind of skewed my view of things somewhat. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I found very early on, and it made some difficulties for me, particularly in my teenage years. I mean, you've got your own personal story, which you've certainly experienced your fair share of difficult times. But I remember struggling to understand why so many people simply seemed to want what they were told to want in life, and it seemed so paltry. And I think it was probably at that time that crystallized in my mind, this had been in the mid-80s, this idea about what because I originally I kind of turned it, as some people do actually. I don't know if this resonates with you. I kind of turned it in on myself a little bit at first. That it would kind of, that I was somehow at fault. You know, why don't I get it? Why don't I want 2.5 cars and 2.5 children and 2.5 lawnmowers or whatever? You know, why don't I want a blender and a tumble dryer and a microwave and, you know, a steady job and early retirement and membership of a golf club, which I did have briefly actually. You know, why don't I want why isn't that enough?
Well, I don't know if I ever had much doubts about my doubts in that regard, although, because I said I did have this attitude that anyone who was happy with the way things were and who would settle for that kind of thing was just an idiot. I had that attitude as a teenager and even before that, I think. And that was part of my elitism, but it was also an existential awareness of the splinter, to use the movie cliche. And my existential ennui did go deeper than that. Like, I felt I couldn't be happy in reality, never mind in a nice house with a nice car and a nice wife kind of thing that you're describing. I knew I wouldn't be happy with that, but I felt I couldn't even be happy with reality because I had this existential dilemma, or it's more than a dilemma, but anxiety around feeling unreal. That existence felt unreal to me, and I would think that I probably carried that over from childhood, as what you described as being a child. I don't know how young you were, but looking around at adults and thinking, what the hell's wrong with these people? I know of someone else who had that experience very acutely as a child and even promised themselves they would never turn into that. And although I don't remember that precisely, I'm positive that I had that experience too. And I think probably most children do, or did. Maybe that, as I say, we're degenerating rapidly as a species, and that children are being taken over younger and younger by the delusion that this is it, the materialist delusion that material satisfaction is not just enough, but it's all there is, therefore it has to be enough. Which was kind of my father's philosophy and attitude, but he wasn't very convincing because my father was an alcoholic and a very unhappy man. So although he badmouthed religion and he talked as if he was happy with just, with just a comfortable life, he clearly wasn't. And I don't think anybody can be. It was just popped into my head what Rudolf Steiner said, that atheism, if it was understood properly, atheism would be diagnosable as a psychological form of dysfunction, as a mental illness. I don't like the expression mental illness, but I think he used it. As a form of insanity even. I think that's true, in a certain sense that atheism, which is inseparable from materialism and also nihilism, I would say that they all bleed into each other, it is a symptom of being dysfunctional, being biologically and psychologically dysfunctional, because the real nature of existence is that everything is imbued with some numinous essence of divine, eternal meaning. I think that's absolutely undeniable. I also think it's undeniable that it's very, very, very hard to connect to it and stay connected to it. But what I'm talking about here is a complete lack of connection to it, but worse, a lack of awareness of the disconnect. So for me, the awareness of being disconnected was what drove me through my life. I knew that I had lost touch with something. At some point, I don't remember when it happened, or I do have a certain key memory where something happened, but I think it must have been before that. I lost touch with reality, but I never lost touch with the realization or the awareness that I'd lost touch with reality, and that kept me going. Now, I'm trying to bring it back to our general subject, which is what makes a difference between people. I think, or at least I'm going to try and articulate something that I might think, that if people lose, or bodies, human bodies, because I'm not sure what people means really, lose all touch with reality and even forget that they have, then I think they become like empty vessels, because they're not, if they don't have a connection to divine, then the divine can't move through them. If they're not connected to their souls, then their souls can't incarnate. So then I think they become like host bodies for, like nature abhors a vacuum, for something else, which I'll leave blank for now. And that if that happens, that can accrue generationally. So you can have bodies who are disconnected from reality and forget completely, and so then they get taken over by material urges and material memes and agendas, and then they have children.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com